The shattered vow. Sarah Miller never imagined her life would descend into a scene so devastating, so utterly humiliating, that it would leave an indelible mark on her soul. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her head, composed, delivering the news calmly, prepared for surprise, perhaps even discomfort. But nothing had prepared her for the reaction she received. She stood in the elegant glass and steel office of Brightstone Investments, her fingers nervously clutching the small ultrasound photo in her pocket. The morning sun streamed through the panoramic windows behind the imposing mahogany desk, where David Coleman sat in his characteristic custom-made navy suit, flipping through financial reports as if nothing in the world could faze him. Her heart pounded as she cleared her throat, barely able to find her voice. "David," she began, her voice trembling in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like thunder, sudden and sharp, cutting through the room's calm stillness. He didn't look up at first. When he finally did, his piercing blue eyes met hers, but they held no warmth, no surprise, no joy, only calculation. Seconds stretched into silence until he leaned back in his chair, clasped his hands, and said, almost lazily, "I will never marry you." No emotion, no questions, just that. Cold, dismissive, definitive. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. The man she thought she knew, the man she had loved despite every red flag and every warning from her own instincts, was gone. Or perhaps he had never truly existed. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. There was nothing to say. Her mind raced, searching for logic, a reason, some vestige of the man who once whispered she meant more to him than any business or title. Instead, she was looking at someone entirely different, someone indifferent, impenetrable, and ruthlessly distant. He didn't ask whose it was. He didn't ask how far along she was. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply stood up, adjusted his jacket cuffs, and said, "This conversation is over." She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand acknowledgement. But something deep within her, something deeper than pride, kept her motionless. She nodded once, turned, and walked out of the office with her back straight, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. As the elevator doors closed behind her, her vision blurred with tears, but her face remained serene. She knew in that moment that she was utterly alone, yet she also knew she would survive. Not for him, not for the past, but for the life growing inside her. The days that followed were a blur of silence, cold rain, and crushing reality. Sarah packed her belongings and left London without telling anyone. The lease for her apartment was in David's company name. She couldn't bear the thought of staying there another night, breathing the same air that had once smelled like home, but now only reeked of betrayal. She moved to a small town 2 hours away, the same one where she had grown up, quiet and detached from the chaos of the corporate world. She hadn't been there in years, but the streets felt familiar enough for her to feel like she could at least breathe again. She rented a modest one-bedroom apartment above an old bookstore and began working remotely, taking on small freelance design projects at night while morning sickness ravaged her body. Each day was harder than the last. There were no calls from David, no attempts to find her, no messages asking if she was okay. The rejection hurt more than she allowed herself to admit. She cried most nights alone in her narrow bed, clutching the ultrasound photo to her chest as her belly slowly began to swell. The loneliness was suffocating, yet she pressed on. She attended all her doctor's appointments alone, checked off prenatal vitamin lists, and tried to eat as best she could. Her heart ached, not only from the absence of love, but also from the overwhelming pressure of doing this alone. She had no family to lean on. Her mother had passed away 2 years prior after a long battle with cancer, and her father had been absent since she was a child. There was no one but her, and the two tiny lives silently forming within her. In her second trimester, the doctor confirmed she was having twins. She had smiled when she saw them clearly on the screen, two tiny profiles, little arms moving independently, two separate heartbeats, strong and fast. It was a brief moment of hope in an otherwise gray existence. She left that appointment clutching the printed ultrasound photos tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. Not from fear this time, but from something closer to awe. Whatever happened, she had them, and that had to be enough. As the weeks turned into months, her body grew heavier and more tired. She still worked long hours because medical bills quickly accumulated, and insurance barely covered the essentials. Some nights, she fell asleep with her laptop open beside her, her entire body aching. But she refused to give in. She kept a notebook on her nightstand where she wrote letters to her daughters. She didn't know their names yet, but she wrote to them as if they were already here, as if they could hear her voice in the silence. She wouldn't let herself think about David. When his name entered her mind, she pushed it away. The man who had once made her feel seen had vanished like a ghost. There was no point mourning someone who had already chosen to disappear. Her focus had to be on the babies and surviving each day until they arrived. But even as she tried to let go, something in her chest remained bruised, not broken, but wounded in a way that would take time to understand. And so, she pressed on, quiet and determined, unaware that fate was already working to bring their worlds together again in a way neither of them could have imagined. Do you think David deserves a second chance to know his daughters? Or did his ego condemn him forever? Leave your comment and subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion of this story. When Sarah reached her 8th month, exhaustion had become her constant companion. The swelling in her legs made it difficult to stand for extended periods, and sharp lower back pains forced her to sleep sitting up most nights. Though she rarely complained aloud, her doctor began to note signs of concern during her weekly checkups. The babies weren't gaining weight as quickly as expected, and Sarah herself was clearly reaching her limits. After a brief scare involving shortness of breath and contractions that suddenly started and stopped, she was admitted to the local hospital for observation. What was supposed to be a precautionary overnight stay quickly escalated when one of the twins began to show signs of distress during monitoring. The doctors decided to perform an early C-section. Sarah was too exhausted to protest, barely able to process the words, as nurses gently prepared her for surgery. Everything felt surreal. The coldness of the hospital gown, the bright lights of the operating room, the murmur of voices around her. She squeezed her eyes shut and whispered a silent prayer for her daughters to come out breathing. And then she heard it. The first cry, thin and weak, quickly followed by a second, a little stronger. Tears streamed down her face. Both girls were alive, tiny, fragile, barely 5 pounds each, but breathing. The nurses whisked them off to the NICU while Sarah was stitched up and sent to recovery. The next few days were a haze of beeping monitors, IV drips, and waiting. Her daughters became Clara and Sophia, names she had written in her notebook weeks before, but hadn't dared to utter aloud until they were safely here. She could only visit them for brief periods at first, sitting beside their incubators, speaking to them in hushed, tearful tones. They looked so tiny, their little faces almost swallowed by the small hats and blankets meant to keep their body temperatures stable. It hurt to leave them each night and return to her hospital bed alone, but she knew they were in good hands. Still, the ache of not being able to hold them freely, of not being able to take them home, weighed heavily on her spirit. Doctors informed her that due to the baby's prematurity and her own post-operative weakness, They would remain in the hospital for at least another month, possibly longer. That time stretched to 2 months, then 3. Sarah's savings dwindled rapidly, yet she refused to show her panic. She pumped breast milk regularly, sat by their side as much as she was allowed, and used her free hours in the hospital room to work online design projects on her old laptop. It was lonely, painfully lonely, and the mental strain was beginning to crack her resolve. She hadn't had visitors in weeks. The nurses were kind but busy. Her body was healing, but her heart felt paused, caught between survival and the life she wanted to build. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. David arrived at the hospital, utterly oblivious to who was there. He wasn't visiting for personal reasons. One of his key business partners had been in a minor car accident and was admitted for observation. David, ever the loyal leader of his empire, thought it would be good to stop by and see the man in person. But between illegible signage and a distracted receptionist, he took the wrong elevator and ended up on the pediatric floor instead of general care. As he walked down the brightly lit corridor, confused, he caught a glimpse of something, someone, that made him stop dead in his tracks. At first, he wasn't sure. A woman in hospital pajamas, her hair in a messy bun, stood by a double stroller, expertly adjusting a bottle. Her back was to him, but something in her posture, the curve of her shoulders, felt familiar. She turned slightly, and the light caught her face. It was Sarah. David stood there, stunned. He felt as if the air had been knocked out of him. She hadn't seen him yet. She was humming softly, rocking the stroller. Then she looked up, and their eyes met. The world seemed to stop for both of them. Her face paled. He took an uncertain step forward. Neither said a word. And then, slowly, his gaze dropped to the 2 babies sleeping side by side in the stroller. Both had delicate dark hair, and when one stirred and opened her surprisingly blue, familiar eyes, his stomach lurched. The realization hit him like a wave. These were his daughters. Not a rumor, not a suspicion. They were here. The real, living proof of the life he had rejected. Sarah said nothing. She didn't cry or scream. She picked up the bottle, turned her back, and walked calmly into the hospital room. But David couldn't move. His body was rooted to the spot, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do next. David remained standing outside the hospital room door for several minutes, unable to will his legs to move or his mouth to form words. His brain was still trying to grasp what his eyes had seen. 2 tiny girls who resembled him so closely, it was like looking at baby photos of himself. The woman he had once dismissed without a second thought stood just beyond that door, raising his children alone, while he had gone on with his life as if nothing had happened. A nurse walked by and glanced at him with mild concern, but he quickly straightened and knocked twice, softly but firmly. There was a pause. Then the door cracked open. Sarah stood there, quiet but wary, her eyes unreadable. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She raised her eyebrows slightly, waiting, then finally stepped aside, motioning him in. The room was small, dimly lit, with a bassinet pushed against the wall and 2 bassinets near the window. One of the girls was sleeping. The other stirred gently, making small noises as she waved her fists in the air. David entered slowly, as if a sudden movement might break the fragile moment. He walked over to the bassinets and stared down at the baby. Her eyes were closed, but her face was a mirror of her mother's. There was no denying it. These were his daughters. "Are they?" he began, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah didn't look at him. She sat on the edge of the bassinet and folded her arms tightly. "Yes," she said simply. They're yours." The words hit him like a punch. He reeled slightly, then pulled up the plastic chair near the bassinet and sat down heavily. The room was silent except for the occasional beep of a nearby monitor and the soft sighs of the sleeping infants. David ran a hand through his hair, looking at the floor, then at her. She looked so different from the last time he'd seen her. Tired, pale, worn, but somehow stronger, more grounded, as if everything he had overlooked before had finally come to light. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, his tone more bewildered than accusatory. Sarah let out a dry laugh, not cruel, but bitter. "I did. You just didn't care to listen." He opened his mouth to protest, but stopped, because she was right. He had dismissed her, disregarded her, closed the door on any possibility that the pregnancy was real or that it mattered. Now he was sitting amidst the wreckage of that moment, trying to pick up pieces that might be too broken to repair. He looked at her again, really looked at her this time, not as a problem to solve or a mistake to erase, but as a person who had endured something he couldn't yet comprehend. "I didn't know," he said softly, "and I didn't know what kind of man I was until now." Sarah turned to him then, not softening, but confronting him head-on. "They've been in this hospital for 3 months," she said. "They were born premature. I had surgery. I almost lost one of them. I haven't left this room for more than an hour in weeks. So forgive me if I'm not exactly thrilled to see you standing here like you've won a medal for being late." Her voice didn't rise, but the anger beneath it trembled like something tightly contained. David nodded, not defensively, but with a real weight. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. He looked at his daughters, then back at her. "Can I stay?" he asked, "just for a little while." Sarah didn't answer immediately. She looked at her babies, both asleep again, and something shifted in her face. Less fury, more fatigue. She nodded once, then leaned back against the bassinet and closed her eyes. David remained where he was, unmoving, simply sitting in stunned silence. He still didn't know what this meant. He didn't know what would come next. But he understood one thing with utter clarity. This wasn't about pride, ego, or control anymore. This was about showing up. For once in his life, he was willing to start there. David returned the next day, sooner than even he expected. He hadn't slept much the night before. His mind had been an agitated torrent of images and thoughts that wouldn't let him find peace. The sight of those 2 girls, so tiny and delicate, yet so undeniably his, had burrowed into him in a way nothing else ever had. He found himself standing outside the same hospital room door again at 7 a.m., carrying a paper bag with coffee and a small container of oatmeal, unsure if Sarah would accept them, but needing to try. He hesitated before knocking, worried she wouldn't want to see him again after yesterday. But when the door opened, she didn't seem surprised, just glanced at the bag and said, "You're late." It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't rejection either. He stepped inside, and she took the coffee without comment. The babies were awake, fussy but quiet, and David instinctively moved towards their bassinets. He stared down at Sophia, who was chewing on her fist, her tiny brows furrowed as if in deep concentration. Sarah watched him carefully, but didn't interfere. She noticed his hesitation when he reached for the bottle, and without speaking, she passed it to him, allowing him to feed Sophia under her silent supervision. His hands were clumsy, but he was careful. Sophia took the bottle, and David looked at her in awe as her tiny lips latched on. Something in the weight of that moment grounded him in a way no boardroom negotiation ever had. From that day on, David came every morning and stayed until late evening. He brought food, asked questions, read baby books in the waiting room during the girls' naps, and slowly learned to change diapers and swaddle properly. Sarah didn't make it easy for him. She didn't pretend his sudden involvement erased months of absence, but she didn't push him away either. She assigned him tasks, allowed him to take turns holding the girls, and even permitted him to be present during some of the pediatrician's checkups. She remained cool, practical, and utterly focused on the babies, never hinting if she saw a future for the two of them beyond this temporary hospital rhythm. Still, something began to shift. In the quiet hours of the day, when the girls napped and the nurses had done their rounds, David and Sarah sometimes talked, not about them, not about the past, but about things that felt neutral and safe. He asked her about the freelance work she'd been doing, and she told him about the small projects she'd taken on, how she'd used her skills to get by. He told her about his company's expansion, but in a softer, more human way, like someone describing a life he wasn't sure mattered anymore. She listened, sometimes nodded, but often remained silent. Yet her silence no longer felt cold. It felt guarded, like someone trying to rebuild a wall that had been torn down. One afternoon, while holding Clara against his chest, the baby fell asleep, and David found himself crying. He didn't weep openly, but his eyes welled up, and he blinked several times to keep the tears from falling. Sarah saw him and said nothing, simply passing him a burp cloth without comment, and he accepted it with a grateful look. That moment, quiet and brief, felt like the first thread of trust tightening between them. Neither spoke of it afterward, but something unspoken hung in the air from that day on. David stopped checking his phone during visits, stopped answering work emails from the hospital room. His assistants were bewildered by his absence, but he offered no explanations. For the first time in years, business wasn't first. The girls were, and though Sarah didn't verbalize it, she noticed. She watched him adapt, learn, and strive, and though she didn't utter the words aloud, a part of her was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was serious this time. By the end of the 5th week, the nurses no longer raised eyebrows when David walked in and took one of the girls with as much natural ease as if he'd always been there. And while Sarah still kept her walls high, her gaze lingered on him longer. Her tone softened slightly, and when he brought a small stuffed giraffe for Clara and a pacifier with a blue ribbon for Sophia, she didn't scoff. She smiled barely, but it was real. David saw it, discreetly tucked it into his heart, and didn't push for more. For now, showing up was enough. By the start of the 3rd month, David had seamlessly integrated into the hospital's daily rhythm. No longer an awkward visitor, but a constant presence. Nurses spoke to him by name, gave him updates on Clara and Sophia without needing to ask who he was. Sarah also noticed the subtle shift, how naturally he moved now, how confidently he handled bottles, how he knew the exact lullaby that helped Clara drift to sleep when she was fussy. He wasn't just trying anymore. He was there, every day, without fail, without excuses. The girls had steadily gained weight and were finally approaching the discharge threshold. Sarah, though relieved, was also quietly terrified. For 3 months, they had existed in this sterile, tiny, yet safe cocoon. She had grown accustomed to the monitors, the nurses, the shared responsibility. The hospital had become the strange bubble where her life had stabilized, where her pain had been put on hold by necessity. But soon she would leave, and then what? Back to a tiny apartment with barely enough room for 1 crib, let alone 2? Back to the grind of working all night while raising 2 infants alone? And now, with David's presence becoming a constant, something her daughters already expected. What if he disappeared again? David seemed to sense her anxiety. though she never voiced it aloud. One afternoon, as Sarah silently folded the girls' hospital clothes, he quietly asked, "Where will you go when they're discharged?" She hesitated, then replied carefully, "To my apartment. It's small, but I've managed." He stared at her for a long moment, not with pity, but with something more complex: admiration, guilt, hesitation. "You shouldn't have had to manage alone," he said. Sarah didn't respond. The silence between them was thick with all that remained unsaid. The next morning he arrived with more than just coffee. He handed her an envelope. Inside was a printed lease for a small house a few blocks from her current apartment, with 2 bedrooms, a garden, and an already furnished nursery. Sarah looked at him in disbelief. "I don't want you to think this is some grand gesture," he said. "You don't owe me anything. It's just a place, a safer, easier place for them." She didn't respond immediately. Her first instinct was to refuse, to protect her independence, her pride. But then she looked at Sophia, who had just tried to roll over, and Clara, who had finally gained enough strength to cry loudly when she wanted to be held. Sarah's pride was no more important than their well-being. Still, she kept her voice steady. "You're not buying us," she said. David nodded. "I know. It's not that." Later that night, as the babies slept, Sarah found herself standing by the window, arms crossed, watching the streetlights flicker below. David read silently on the sofa, one hand resting near Clara's bassinet. He didn't talk much anymore, unless she initiated conversation. She appreciated that. It gave her space. Still, tonight felt heavier than usual. "Why did you really come back that day?" she asked suddenly. He didn't look up at first. Then he closed his book and said, "Because I got lost on the wrong floor. And then I saw you, and I realized everything I'd spent my life chasing meant nothing compared to what I'd thrown away." His honesty stunned her. Not because of what he said, but how he said it. Quietly, without drama, without expectation. It wasn't a performance. It was simply the truth. She didn't reply, but she didn't turn away either. She stood by the window a little longer, and when she finally sat down, she did so beside him. The gap between them was still wide, but not as wide as it had been. The following week, the doctors finally gave the official all clear. Clara and Sophia were ready to go home. David was in the room when the announcement came, and Sarah saw him blink rapidly as if holding back tears. Discharge papers were signed, car seats were brought in, and tiny outfits were chosen. David carried the bags. Sarah carried Sophia. A nurse carried Clara towards the waiting hallway. For the first time in months, they walked out of the hospital into the open air, the evening light casting soft shadows on the pavement. David didn't ask to come with them, didn't offer. He simply followed in his own car, parked across the street from her building, and waited until she unlocked the front door. He helped carry in the bags, then lingered in the doorway, unsure. Sarah looked at him, then stepped aside to let him in. It was small, cramped, barely enough room for the bassinets, but it was warm, and it was hers. And now, for the first time, she felt perhaps it didn't have to be hers alone. The first few days at home were harder than Sarah had imagined, even after months in the hospital. Despite the joy of finally escaping the sterile walls and artificial light, she now had to face the full weight of life on her own turf. 2 newborns demanding her attention every hour, feedings bleeding into each other, sleepless nights becoming the new normal. The apartment felt even smaller now, the cribs taking up the entire bedroom, and the tiny kitchen barely accommodating a bottle sterilizer and a pump. Sarah found herself struggling to manage even the simplest things, like showering or making a full meal. The silence of home, once a source of peace, became overwhelming in those long nights filled with crying. David didn't ask to stay. He never imposed himself. But the day after they were discharged, he showed up at her door just after dawn with bags of groceries, and she didn't stop him from entering. He moved quietly through the kitchen, putting away essentials into the fridge, brewing coffee, and making oatmeal while the girls slept. When Sarah woke to the smell, for the first time in weeks, her body felt something close to safety. She walked into the kitchen, bleary-eyed and unsure what to say. But he didn't press her, simply handed her a mug of coffee and said, "Sit, eat. I'll change them when they wake up." That became their rhythm. David arrived each morning and left late in the evening. Sometimes he cooked, sometimes he simply cleaned, but he was always present. He held the girls when Sarah needed to nap, walked them around the apartment when they were fussy, and sat with them in the dead of night when colic stole their sleep. Sarah hesitated at first, always waiting for the shoe to drop, for the moment he would stop showing up. But it never came. He returned again and again, becoming more comfortable, more familiar, more quietly entrenched in their lives. One afternoon, 2 weeks after they came home, Sarah found him sitting on the living room floor with both girls in his lap. They were dressed in matching pajamas, and he was reading a picture book about animals to them, mimicking the sounds with a tenderness she would never have expected from the man who once dismissed her so firmly. She stood in the hallway, watching the three of them in the soft glow of the lamp, something in her chest aching in a way she couldn't quite describe. It wasn't just the sight of her daughter smiling or the warmth in David's voice. It was that for the first time since she said she was pregnant, she didn't feel alone surviving. He noticed her watching, but said nothing, simply continued reading, his voice calm and steady. Later that night, when the girls were asleep, Sarah offered him a beer from the fridge, an unspoken gesture that something was shifting between them. They sat on the sofa, shoulders barely touching, the soft hum of the baby monitor filling the silence. David sipped slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I think about that day in the office more than you know," he finally said. "What I said, what I didn't say. I was a coward. I was selfish. I thought leaving would make it go away." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She stared straight ahead, unsure if his remorse should comfort or anger her. But she finally said, "I didn't need you perfect. I just needed you to care." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I didn't care. Not then. But I do now." His voice cracked slightly, and he looked at her then, truly looked at her, like someone seeing the full weight of what he had lost. Sarah's hands tightened around her mug. She wasn't ready to let go of all the pain, not yet, but she was also tired of carrying it alone. "This isn't about us," she finally said. "It's about them. I can't afford for them to trust someone who won't stay." David nodded again, this time more slowly. "Then I'll keep staying until you believe I will." And he did, day after day. Sarah stopped counting after the 4th week. By then, he had also started helping with her freelance work, setting up her website, handling small invoices, giving her the space to catch a few hours of sleep between client calls and bottle feedings. He never brought up their past unless she did, never hinted that he wanted more. He simply became part of their lives, a quiet, unwavering support. Even the neighbors started referring to him as the girl's dad, and Sarah didn't correct them, because in every real sense he was. When the girls turned 6 months old, David surprised her. He had printed all the photos she'd taken over the past few months, the first baths, the first smiles, the sleepy cuddles, and organized them into a handmade scrapbook, leaving the last page blank. When she asked why, he said softly, Because we're still writing the rest. Sarah looked at the empty page for a long moment before closing the book and whispering, "Let's hope the story is worth finishing." David leaned across the sofa and touched her hand. She didn't pull away. In that quiet moment, there was no forgiveness expressed, no declarations of love or dramatic promises, just presence, just choice. And for now, that was more than enough. The night before Clara and Sophia's first birthday, Sarah found herself alone in the living room, surrounded by balloons she hadn't yet hung and cupcakes she hadn't frosted. The girls were asleep in their cribs after a chaotic afternoon bath, and David had gone to pick up some last-minute decorations from the store. The apartment, though still small, now felt different, filled with warmth and history, marked by the steady hum of the life that had been painstakingly and beautifully built over the past year. The walls bore the signs of their story: framed photos, crayon smudges, and even a small dent near the hallway from when David accidentally bumped the stroller into the corner. Sarah stood in the quiet, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to take in the reality of what they had become. This year had tested her in every imaginable way. There were nights she cried alone in the bathroom just to release the pressure of being everything all at once: mother, provider, protector. But David had been there every single day, quietly reinforcing the foundation beneath her with actions, not promises. He never pressured her, never rushed her healing, never made demands about what their relationship should be. Instead, he poured himself into the role of a father with a devotion that sometimes awed her. He remembered every doctor's appointment, handled middle-of-the-night fevers with quiet precision. He had memorized their favorite songs, their feeding schedules, even which pacifier each preferred. Somewhere along the way, without either of them announcing it, they had become a family. When he returned that evening, arms laden with streamers and paper crowns, he gave her a tired but genuine smile. "I think I bought out the entire party aisle," he joked, but Sarah could hear the underlying nervousness in his voice. They both knew what this night symbolized. It wasn't just a birthday. It was the end of the first chapter, and possibly the beginning of something more. After the girls were back in bed, after story time and lullabies, and Sophia's stubborn refusal to sleep until David had rocked her for a full 10 minutes, Sarah and David found themselves sitting at the small kitchen table, sharing a slice of birthday cake. The air was different, more fragile. She looked at him and said, "You've done more than I ever expected of you." He looked back at her, carefully. "I didn't come here to prove anything. I came because I couldn't imagine not being here." She hesitated, then got up and walked over to the small shelf in the living room where the scrapbook still sat. She opened it to the last page, the blank one, and slid in a photo she'd printed just hours before. It was all four of them, on the sofa, the girls in matching pajamas, David laughing heartily, and Sarah looking at him with an expression she hadn't realized had been captured: hopeful, open, complete. She slid the photo into the sleeve and whispered, "That's our new first page." David walked across the room slowly, unsure what to say. But before he could speak, Sarah turned to face him. "You hurt me, more than I thought I could ever recover from," she said, her voice steady. "But you stayed. You stayed through every hard night, every diaper, every fever, every fight. You showed me who you could be, and that version of you I love." It wasn't a dramatic kiss or an overwhelming hug. He simply stepped forward and took her hand. His fingers trembled. "Then let me be that man, forever. For you, for them." And this time, she didn't hesitate. She nodded, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to lean into him, not because she needed saving, but because she finally believed she didn't have to carry it all alone. The next morning, their apartment was filled with laughter, with tiny squeals, and the slightly off-key singing of two tired but joyful parents. Balloons bounced against the ceiling, streamers tangled on chairs, cupcakes smeared on small hands. It wasn't a perfect party, but it was real, and that made it beautiful. Friends stopped by with gifts, neighbors popped in to hug the girls, and Sarah stood by the window at one point, holding Sophia while Clara crawled after a balloon, and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. David came up behind her, his hand resting gently on her back. "I know I can't go back and rewrite everything," he said softly, "but I want to write the rest with you, whatever it is." Sarah turned and kissed his cheek. "Then let's keep turning the page, together." And in that crowded, joyful, chaotic room, they did just that. No grand promises, no perfect ending, just love in its truest, most patient form. The unspoken redemption, a lesson in enduring love. This story doesn't conclude with a dramatic twist, but with something far more powerful, a quiet redemption. What makes the ending satisfying isn't just that David changes, it's that he earns his way back into the lives he once abandoned, not through apologies, but through presence, effort, and time. Sarah doesn't forgive easily, and she shouldn't. Her strength lies not just in surviving alone, but in choosing to let someone back in on her own terms. The girls, too young to know their father's past mistakes, become the very reason he transforms into someone worthy of trust. That's what gives this story its weight. Not just love found, but love rebuilt. And in a world where people often walk away when things get tough, seeing someone stay, truly stay, is the most impactful and beautiful ending of all. If this story moved you, share it and leave a comment with your favorite moment. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will touch your heart.